Welcome back to Hopetales, where an ordinary night turned extraordinary when a 17-year-old girl did what even seasoned pilots couldn't imagine. A thin layer of twilight still clung to the horizon when Flight 782 lifted off the runway, carving its path into the darkening sky. Inside the aircraft, the soft hum of engines blended with the subtle vibration felt beneath the passengers' feet. It was an ordinary evening flight, routine in every sense. With 232 people settling into their seats, business travelers, families, tourists, and a handful of students heading home after long days. Among them sat a 17-year-old girl named Aiza Qureshi, a quiet teenager from a small town who had never imagined that one flight, one night, would carve her name into aviation history. Aiza sat by the window in row 17, clutching her math notebook, reviewing scribbled formulas illuminated by the dim cabin lights. She was returning from a national science competition, still wearing the wristband that identified her as a participant. Her world at that moment was simple. Solve the complex problem assigned for the next round, reach home by midnight, hug her mother, and sleep. Nothing more, nothing less. The plane ascended smoothly, slicing through scattered clouds like a silver arrow. The lights over the aisle glowed softly, casting warm tones across the rows. Aiza glanced outside, watching the world transform into a sea of lights far below. She imagined the people living their quiet lives, eating dinner, watching TV, preparing for bed, unaware of the night that was about to unfold high above them. 30 minutes into the flight, everything felt calm. The cabin crew moved gracefully between aisles, adjusting overhead bins, distributing water, and checking seatbelts. A young boy in row 12 tapped his shoes rhythmically against the floor, excited for the vacation ahead. A businessman reclined his seat, already drifting into sleep. An elderly couple whispered softly to each other, holding hands under a shared blanket. Nothing hinted at danger. Nothing hinted that within minutes, the crew and passengers would face a crisis so severe that only a miracle or a hero could save them. Up front, sealed behind the cockpit door, the two pilots, experienced, confident, and meticulous, managed the aircraft with practiced ease. Their hands moved over switches and levers, their eyes scanning instruments glowing in red, blue, and green. The aircraft was stable. Weather was clear. Wind was cooperative. Autopilot held the jet on its intended path like a steel guardian, until it didn't. Aiza shifted in her seat, stretching her legs. She closed her notebook and stared outside again. The sky had deepened into a shade of navy blue, dotted with stars barely visible through thin cloud layers. She rested her head against the window, feeling the subtle warmth of the cabin. And then she noticed something odd. A sudden tremor passed through the plane, not violent but noticeable, like a pulse, quick, sharp, unsettling. Aiza sat up straight. Around her, the passengers glanced up, curious but not alarmed. The overhead lights flickered once and corrected themselves. The engines maintained their steady hum, but Aiza sensed something shifting in the atmosphere, like a silent signal that something wasn't right. Up in the cockpit, the captain's vision blurred for a moment. He blinked rapidly, trying to refocus, but the haze spread like ink across water. His co-pilot reached for a switch, but his arm moved sluggishly. A metallic taste filled his mouth. A strange dizziness consumed him. The cockpit lights glared brighter than before, almost painfully. Within seconds, the captain slumped against his seat, unconscious. Moments later, the co-pilot's breathing slowed, his hands falling limp beside the throttle. The cockpit fell silent, except for the drone of engines and the steady beeping of unattended warnings. Autopilot continued to fly, unaware that the humans guiding it were gone. Back in the cabin, the tremor came again, slightly stronger. Aiza looked around, noticing a flight attendant pause midway down the aisle. Concern etched across her face. She reached for the intercom panel near the galley but froze, staring toward the cockpit instinctively, as if sensing something was very wrong. Another flicker ran through the cabin lights. Then came the sound that shifted every heartbeat. On board, a muffled alarm. From the front of the aircraft, no one knew what it was except the crew. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Something was happening. Something they could not see, could not understand, and definitely could not control. The head flight attendant approached the cockpit door, knocking urgently. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. The alarm inside grew slightly louder, pulsing like a heartbeat under strain. She reached for the emergency key, hands shaking just enough to reveal her rising fear. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. Then she froze completely. The sight before her stole every breath from her body. Both pilots lay slumped in their seats, unmoving. Warning lights flashed aggressively across the cockpit panels. The aircraft remained on autopilot, but altitude readings flickered irregularly on the screens. Something was failing, something crucial, and the only two people who could stop it were unconscious. The attendant rushed back into the cabin, panic blooming across her face. Passengers sensed it instantly. A murmur spread through the rows like a wave. Aiza felt her heartbeat quicken, each beat echoing louder in her ears. She watched the attendants whisper frantically to one another, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the cockpit. Without anyone announcing it, fear began to thicken in the air. A passenger stood up, demanding to know what was happening. Another grabbed their phone, trying to connect to the in-flight Wi-Fi, searching for reassurance or answers. A baby began to cry somewhere near the back, its small voice trembling with confusion. Aiza felt her palms grow damp. She reached again for her notebook, not for studying this time, but to steady her shaking hands. The plane dipped slightly. Just a small drop, barely noticeable, but enough to make several passengers gasp. The wings steadied a moment later, but the damage was done. The sense of safety was slipping away piece by piece. Aiza's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be turbulence? A mechanical glitch? Something worse? The head attendant tried to reassure the passengers, but her trembling hands betrayed her calm expression. She grabbed the intercom handset and began speaking, but even without hearing the words, Aiza could tell from her strained posture that the news was not good. Moments later, one phrase crackled through speakers, one phrase that silenced the entire aircraft. The pilots were unresponsive. The cockpit was incapacitated. Flight 782 had no one flying it. Panic erupted in pockets throughout the plane. People clutched armrests. Others prayed silently. A few froze completely, unable to comprehend the gravity of being inside a metal giant hurtling through the sky without a human at the controls. Aiza felt something shift inside her, not fear, but clarity. A strange calm settled over her, the kind she felt during complex math exams or robotics challenges. Her brain began to analyze without permission. She remembered the simulator she once tried at a science fair. She remembered videos she had watched out of curiosity. She wasn't a pilot. She wasn't even an adult, but she understood more than most passengers on board. The plane dipped again, lower this time. The alarms doubled. The lights flickered. And Aiza realized one terrifying truth. If no one stepped forward soon, 232 lives, including hers, would be lost. She exhaled slowly, steadying her heart. The moment that would define her life had just begun. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, almost hypnotically, but it carried a new tension now, a vibration unlike before. The plane was still in autopilot, stubbornly clinging to altitude, yet the air inside was thick with fear and disbelief. Passengers had quieted, their murmurs now whispers, their glances darting toward the cockpit door like fragile lifelines. Every movement seemed slower, more deliberate, as if the very air conspired to heighten the sense of danger. Aiza's eyes never left the cockpit. The sight of the pilots slumped over their controls refused to leave her mind. Her heart thumped, but amid the chaos, a strange clarity began to crystallize. Time was no longer a series of minutes. It was an endless stretch where each second weighed 1,000 pounds. She could not think of herself as a teenager. She could not let the thought of her age, her inexperience, or her ordinary life interfere. There were 232 lives suspended in the fragile balance of metal, air and human error or absence of it. The cabin shook again, a subtle dip that sent a ripple of panic through the passengers. A young man clutched the back of the seat in front of him, knuckles white. A mother instinctively covered her child's eyes, pressing the baby against her chest. Somewhere near the back, a tray fell, clattering loudly on the floor. Each sound seemed magnified, echoing as if the plane itself was voicing its distress. Aiza's mind raced. She remembered every aviation video she had ever watched, every glimpse of a cockpit she had seen in a simulator, every term she vaguely understood. She did not know the difference between the throttle and the yoke, not completely. But instinct and an unyielding will began to pull the pieces together. If the autopilot could maintain altitude, perhaps she could manage direction. Perhaps she could hold the plane steady long enough to figure out what to do next. She stood slowly, heart hammering, and moved toward the cockpit. Flight attendants tried to stop her, but their faces betrayed uncertainty, and something about Aiza's calm resolve silenced their protests. Every step she took down the aisle felt like walking on a tightrope suspended over a chasm. The overhead bins creaked slightly as she passed. Every passenger seemed to hold their breath. The plane tilted just enough to remind everyone how delicate their situation had become. As she approached the cockpit, the alarms inside pulsed relentlessly, red and orange lights flashing against the darkness. Aiza opened the door, stepping into a small space flooded with chaos. The faint glow of instrument panels cast shadows across the unconscious pilots. She looked at the screens, numbers, and gauges that flickered with information she barely understood. Altitude, airspeed, heading, autopilot engaged. Her mind worked frantically, scanning for patterns, trying to find a way to anchor the aircraft before gravity itself became the enemy. The plane dipped again, sharper this time. A collective gasp erupted from the cabin. The wings tilted slightly, a stark reminder that metal and air were no longer indifferent companions. Aiza's hands shook as she reached toward the yoke. Her fingers brushed the smooth control, and instinct guided her. She felt the plane respond, subtle and immediate, as if the aircraft sensed her determination. Not perfect, not precise, but stable enough to prevent immediate disaster. She turned back toward the cabin, scanning rows of faces. Panic, fear, and hope all swirled in a complicated mosaic. Some passengers had started to murmur prayers under their breaths. Others sat frozen, disbelief rooting them to their seats. Aiza realized that if she faltered, if she hesitated, the plane would descend into chaos, and there would be no second chance. She could not falter. The autopilot, though still engaged, began to struggle with subtle turbulence. High above the clouds, wind currents tugged at the aircraft. The plane tilted slightly to the right, then the left. Warning lights flashed more urgently. Aiza felt the metal beneath her hands vibrate. The engines hummed, but the sound was no longer comforting. It was a reminder of the delicate balance she had to maintain. She gripped the yoke tighter, her knuckles white, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline surging through her body. Minutes felt like hours. She focused on the cabin, the passengers, the small gestures of trust being placed upon her. Every tilt, every flash of the instrument panel, every faint vibration through the floor became a signal she could read, a language she could decipher in real time. She experimented carefully, adjusting the yoke, nudging the autopilot controls, stabilizing the plane. Small victories, barely noticeable, but enough to keep the aircraft level for now. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly. Stars glimmered faintly through thin clouds. City lights far below, a silent witness to the high altitude. Drama unfolding above them. The plane moved like a living organism, responding to her touch, her instincts. Aiza felt the gravity of her responsibility, the lives depending on her skill and composure. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Fear was something she could only acknowledge, then push aside. Back in the cabin, passengers began to notice subtle changes. The dips were less severe. The plane's vibrations steadied. Eyes widened in realization, and some clasped hands together, silently acknowledging that someone was keeping them safe. Flight attendants moved cautiously, offering water, attempting to maintain calm, their own fear tempered by the faint, quiet authority emanating from the girl in the cockpit doorway. The plane had stabilized, barely, but the crisis was far from over. Every instrument still flashed warnings. Fuel levels, altitude, airspeed, heading, all had to be monitored. Aiza barely knew what each number meant, but she sensed patterns, noticed changes, and responded. It was an intricate dance of instinct, observation, and courage she didn't know she possessed. Suddenly, a sharper jolt rattled the plane. The wings rocked in response. The alarm screamed again, more urgent than before. Aiza's stomach lurched as she countered the tilt, her hands precise and unwavering despite her trembling heart. The autopilot fought with the turbulence, and she had to intervene constantly, balancing the plane with minute adjustments. Every passenger felt the intensity, their stomachs tightening, breaths caught in collective suspense. Time had lost meaning. There were no seconds, no minutes, only survival. only the delicate balance between gravity and metal, fear and composure, life and death. And amid it all, a 17-year-old girl was holding the line, her hands guiding a massive jet through the night, while the rest of the world waited in helpless hope. For now, the plane remained airborne, stable enough to avoid immediate catastrophe, but Asa knew the night had only just begun. The sky above promised no mercy, and the challenges ahead would test every ounce of her courage and skill. One miscalculation, one hesitation, could turn the aircraft into a tomb, yet she did not flinch. She could not. The responsibility was hers now, and the world above the clouds had just begun to notice a quiet, extraordinary force, a teenager refusing to surrender. The night outside stretched endlessly, a dark ocean of clouds punctuated by distant stars and the pale silver glow of the moon. Inside Flight 782, the atmosphere was taut, each second dripping with the weight of anticipation. Isa remained in the cockpit doorway, her small frame barely visible against the harsh glow of warning lights. Every flicker of red, every beep, resonated in her chest as if echoing the heartbeat of the plane itself. The autopilot still maintained its course, but the aircraft was no longer simply following a programmed path. It was a creature in her hands, sensitive, fragile, and demanding absolute attention. The pilots remained unconscious, their bodies slumped over the controls like lifeless mannequins. The girl had memorized the cockpit layout in minutes, the switches and buttons forming a strange, familiar landscape. She touched each instrument with deliberate care, observing, adjusting. She could feel the rhythm of the plane through her hands, the subtle tilt, the vibrations, the airflow over the wings. Her instincts, sharpened by hours of observation and a stubborn refusal to succumb to fear, guided her through the chaos. The cabin behind her was a study in controlled panic. Passengers had ceased moving excessively. Some were frozen, staring ahead, eyes wide with disbelief. Others whispered prayers under their breath, hands tightly clasped. Flight attendants moved quietly, offering small gestures of reassurance, aware that the fragile stability of the plane depended on the girl at the cockpit. Each person on board felt the invisible thread connecting their survival to the steady, determined hands of a teenager who had never flown a plane before. A sudden dip jolted the aircraft sharper than anything so far. Asa's stomach lurched, her breath caught, but she reacted instantly, adjusting the yoke with a careful push. The wings leveled, but the warning alarms blared with renewed urgency. The autopilot struggled to regain full control, and she had to guide it, minute adjustments at a time. She noticed small discrepancies in the readings, slight drops in altitude, fluctuations in speed, unusual shifts in heading. Each anomaly was a puzzle she had to solve on the fly, a test of logic, calm, and resolve. Outside, the clouds thickened, dark masses moving swiftly against the moonlit sky. Lightning illuminated the horizon in fleeting flashes, a reminder that the natural world offered no sympathy. The plane shivered under the occasional turbulence, wings flexing under stress. Passengers felt each movement as if the aircraft were alive, and indeed, in a sense, it was. Its life now intertwined with hers, responsive to her decisions, her courage, her ability to read the subtle signs of a machine designed for experts. Isa's mind raced. She remembered tutorials, videos, diagrams she had studied in her spare time. She recalled emergency procedures, landing sequences, safety checks, all abstract concepts until now, and realized they had become urgent, tangible instructions she had to interpret in real time. The plane's systems, complicated and alien, now communicated with her through vibrations, flashing lights, and subtle changes in pitch. She listened, watched, and reacted, as if a symphony of machines had transformed into a language she alone could understand. Another tremor ran through the fuselage. The plane's nose pitched slightly downward, engines humming with tension. She adjusted the yoke again, countering the tilt with careful, precise movements. Every microsecond mattered. A small error could send the plane plummeting. A misjudgment could cause catastrophic descent. Her fingers ached from gripping controls, yet she could not release them. Her shoulders tensed, back straight, eyes unwavering. The lives of 232 passengers hung on her. Concentration alone, the cabin responded to her steadiness. Passengers felt the plane right itself. The dips softened, the vibrations lessened. The flight attendants exhaled, knowing that some invisible force was guiding them through the storm. Children clung to their parents, still frightened. Yet their panic eased slightly with the subtle reassurance of stability. Even the murmur of anxious whispers began to fade, replaced by a collective hope that perhaps survival was possible. Aza's focus narrowed further. Every light, every gauge became a critical signal. Altitude readings flickered. Fuel indicators demanded scrutiny. Autopilot status needed constant confirmation. The plane's instruments were no longer merely numbers. They were lifelines. Instructions and warnings all at once. Her mind moved at lightning speed, analyzing patterns, predicting the aircraft's next movements, correcting anomalies with instinctive precision. She realized that she was no longer just a passenger. She was the bridge between life and disaster, a living, breathing stabilizer of this massive machine. Outside, the night sky grew more unpredictable. Storm clouds rolled in from a distant front, lightning flashing intermittently across the horizon. Rain began to streak the windows, each droplet catching the dim cabin light. The plane shuddered under the first heavy gusts of wind, and the autopilot struggled against the force. Aza's hands guided the yoke carefully, countering the turbulence, keeping the plane level enough to prevent sudden dives. Her heart pounded, but her movements were deliberate, measured, almost surgical in their precision. Minutes stretched into what felt like eternity. The plane's cabin was a microcosm of tension and hope. Passengers clutched their seats. Flight attendants observed silently, and the girl in the cockpit doorway maintained a fragile balance between chaos and order. Every jolt, every tilt, every warning light was met with calculated action. She adjusted throttle settings, nudged the yoke, monitored the screens, and responded to each anomaly, as though the plane itself were communicating directly with her. The aircraft stabilized again momentarily. Aza allowed herself a fleeting glance toward the passengers. Relief and fear intermingled on their faces, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. But the night was far from over. The storm, the altitude, the mechanical uncertainty, and the pilot's unconscious state meant that danger remained imminent. One mistake, one lapse, and everything could unravel. Yet she did not flinch. She could not. The weight of responsibility, enormous as it was, pressed upon her, but it also sharpened her senses, focused her mind, and reinforced her determination. Outside, the moon peeked through the clouds, a faint guiding light. The plane cut through the darkness, a fragile silver streak against the infinite black sky. Inside, Aza continued to navigate the edge between order and chaos, life and death. Her hands, small but determined, remained on the controls. Her mind, racing but precise, calculated every move, every adjustment. The storm and the night were formidable opponents. But so was she, a teenager holding the fate of hundreds in her hands. Refusing to yield, the plane had survived the worst of the turbulence for now. But ahead lay unknown challenges: approach to airports, landing procedures, fuel management, and the critical question of alerting air traffic control without panic. The night was far from over, and the story of survival was only beginning to take shape. The girl's courage, instinct, and determination had stabilized Flight 782, but the true test, the ultimate confrontation with gravity, machinery, and the unknown, was still looming. And high above the sleeping world, in the endless expanse of the night sky, Aza remained steadfast, a small figure against the vast machinery of human ingenuity and nature's power, holding on to hope for herself and for the 232 lives depending on her. The storm finally began to thin, leaving behind long stretches of dark, open sky. Yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was the heavy quiet that arrives before the most difficult part of any flight. Aza knew the truth deep inside her chest. Keeping the plane stable had been one battle. Bringing it down safely would be a war of its own. The cockpit lights continued their relentless blinking, each warning a reminder of what was at stake. The altitude remained steady, but fuel levels had started dipping lower than she expected. The plane had been flying on autopilot for too long. Every gallon now mattered. Every minute counted. Far below them, the scattered glow of distant cities flickered like constellations. Reversed onto the earth, silent witnesses to the unfolding struggle 30,000 feet above. Aza's hands tightened on the controls. She could feel the subtle tension in the yoke, the slight heaviness as if the plane itself sensed the urgency of its situation. Her arms were tired, her fingers stiff, her breathing shallow. But fatigue was a luxury she couldn't afford. The lives behind her, the restless children, the parents clutching their families, the elderly gripping their armrests, tethered her to reality. Her mind refused to falter. The plane shuddered once more, a small tremor, as if reminding her that the sky was unpredictable even in calmer air. She scanned the instrument panel again, absorbing the glowing numbers, comparing them to the patterns she had memorized. She had no training manual, no expert guidance, no calm mentor voice in her ear. She had instinct, the hunger to survive, and a mind that refused to surrender to fear. The cabin behind her had grown eerily still. Passengers sensed the shift, the feeling that something important was happening, that the moment of truth was drawing closer with every breath. Some closed their eyes in silent hope. Others stared forward, frozen in a mixture of trust and terror. The flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances, knowing the storm had passed, but the danger had not. The girl in the cockpit remained their only anchor in a sky that offered no guarantees. Isa leaned forward, studying the navigation screens. She recognized something, an airport beacon flickering faintly on the map, a runway icon glowing on the radar display. The plane was nearing land. She exhaled slowly, her chest tightening with a new kind of fear. Bringing the aircraft down meant confronting gravity head-on. It meant precision she wasn't sure she had. It meant making decisions that pilots trained years for. But she reminded herself quietly, fiercely, that she had elevated instinct into action all night. She could do it again. She reached for the autopilot switch, her hand trembling. Turning it off felt like stepping off a cliff without wings. When she finally disengaged it, the aircraft reacted immediately, subtle. Unpredictable sways rippled through the fuselage. The plane was no longer following a programmed path. It was listening to her hands alone. The cabin felt the change instantly. The slight dips, the gentle but noticeable shift in direction. Passengers opened their eyes, hearts pounding. The realization spread quietly. Someone was flying the plane. Someone who wasn't supposed to be in that cockpit. Isa managed the descent with movements so small. They were almost invisible. She reduced speed gradually, monitoring the altimeter, adjusting pitch, reacting to the plane's responses. Her breaths grew deeper, steadier, becoming a rhythm she depended on to keep her focus sharp. She imagined the plane as an extension of her own body, responsive, delicate, dependent on balance. As they descended, the clouds parted to reveal the runway lights. Ahead, glowing lines guiding her through the darkness. The sight alone sent a surge of emotion through her. Relief, fear, disbelief, all tangled together. But she couldn't allow herself to feel them fully. Not yet. The hardest moments were approaching. The aircraft dipped lower. Alarms beeped with increasing frequency. Wind currents shifted unpredictably as they approached the edge of the storm system. The runway grew larger in the windshield. But so did the magnitude of her responsibility. The engines roared in response to her adjustments, the entire plane trembling slightly as she lowered the landing gear. The thud of the gear locking into place echoed through the cabin, drawing gasps from passengers. She kept her hands steady, her eyes fixed on the long strip of illuminated concrete that represented survival. The aircraft glided lower, the earth rising to meet them. The red and white runway lights blurred slightly through her exhausted eyes. Her heart hammered like a frantic drum, but her hands stayed firm. The plane dipped too much. Isa immediately corrected the pitch, heart leaping as the aircraft stabilized again. The descent continued, and with every passing second, the runway grew clearer, sharper, more real. The plane sliced through the final layer of clouds, emerging into a world of lights and shadows. Emergency vehicles gathered below, their silhouettes racing into position. The entire airport seemed to hold its breath. Wind buffeted the aircraft from the left, pushing it off alignment. She countered. Another gust from the right. She corrected again. Her body moved instinctively, adjusting angles with a precision she didn't know she was capable of. The plane hovered dangerously close to the runway now, its nose pointed slightly upward, engines humming loudly as gravity demanded its final confrontation. The wheels hit the ground, hard. A jolt surged through the aircraft. Isa's heart jumped, but she held the controls firmly, guiding the plane straight, steady, refusing to let it veer off course. The runway lights raced past the windows in bright streaks. The tires screeched, smoke rising in thin white trails. The plane slowed inch by inch, until the trembling metal giant finally yielded to her command and came to a grinding halt. Silence followed, a deep, endless silence. Then, from the cabin, a ripple of emotion traveled like a shockwave. Tears, relief, hands covering faces, flight attendants sinking into their seats, overwhelmed. The passengers had survived. All 232 souls. The plane had landed, and the girl who was never meant to be a pilot had become the only thing standing. Between them and disaster, Isa finally let her hands fall from the controls. Her body shook, but her heart felt impossibly light. The runway lights glowed softly outside the windshield, reflecting off her face. She knew she had done something extraordinary, not out of desire for recognition, but out of pure, unfiltered human courage. The door opened. Emergency crews rushed in, but the girl sat quietly, exhausted, her mind still processing the impossible night she had conquered. She had not just flown a plane. She had carried 232 lives from the brink of tragedy back into the arms of hope. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew this night would be remembered. Not as a story of fear, but as a testament to what a single act of courage can do when the sky itself feels like it is falling.